However, historically, we've been here before many times. And sooner or later, the tide's going to turn. It took many years for the world to recognise the injustices perpetrated against the indigenous populations. We saw that with slavery, apartheid, the black civil rights movement, and the injustices against the Jews by Germany. These injustices were also ignored for many decades due to community ignorance. And unfortunately, we're repeating the same injustices under another name against a different group, but again we witness this community ignorance. Saying sorry to one deserving dispossessed group, while at the same time completely ignoring the dispossession taking place right under our noses, smacks of hypocrisy, and I find that contemptible. I fully applauded the long overdue apology to the stolen generation and the indigenous population. The fact that it took us 200 years to understand the damage we inflicted on this vulnerable group by denying them their fundamental human rights for so long is a sad indictment on the level of our compassion and empathy. Unfortunately, just like today, during these 200 years of community ignorance, the voices of reason were ridiculed and brushed aside. It's estimated that the stolen generation numbered approximately 50,000 children. We now know the horrendous ramifications of this best interest of the children policy debacle, which ironically was administered by someone with the title of Protector of Aboriginals. But sadly, the figure of 50,000 children representing the stolen generation pales into insignificance when compared with the current level of forcible separation of children from their parents. Now, let me give you some clear evidence to illustrate the depth of the problem. According to the latest ABS figures, there are now almost 700,000 Australian children who have little or no meaningful contact with their non-custodial parents. And there are 312,000 non-custodial parents who no longer have any meaningful contact with their biological children. Out of the estimated 1.5 million extended family members, such as grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins and so on, who were also denied their contact with members of those their families, you find that more than 2.6 million of the nation's citizens are already affected. And that's a pandemic. And the current so-called protector of the best interest of the children, the Family Court of Australia. And incredibly, both parents and children have been forced to go cap in hand to this state institution for more than 30 years now, only to walk away with bloodied noses. And without parenting rights, and stripped of their children and family wealth, which has left them financially and emotionally destitute, many parents are forced to walk away in utter despair or risk facing a jail term. Then to add insult to injury, their offences are labelled as deadbeat parents and are mercilessly persecuted by heartless child support agencies. No scientific evidence has ever been produced anywhere in the world to show that large numbers of non-custodial parents are voluntarily abandoning their children. Yet, this is what is being promoted by those who wish to continue with the current failed policies. And while individual examples of any reprehensible behaviour can always be found anywhere, such as domestic violence and sexual abuse, these should never be used to be allowed to be promoted as being representing the behaviour of the majority group. It comes as no surprise then that so many of our children are neglected and abused in our community. It occurs because checks and balances have been removed by allowing the forced removal of hundreds of thousands of responsible, protective and loving parents from their children. And I put to you this simple question: how on earth are responsible non-custodial parents supposed to meet their duty of care and responsibility obligations to their children when the state allows these children to be removed from them but with absolute impunity? This has to stop. This is absolute madness. How much longer do we think we can continue to keep on removing up to a quarter of the nation's children from their ties of kinship with half of their families before it starts to tear apart the very fabric of our own society? No society can withstand a sustained attack on the biological bonds of its citizens and escape the inevitable consequences. Yet we stand idly by and allow a dictatorial family law industry to continue to impose its perverted will on our society. How much longer are we going to accept the insane notion that the best interest of a child is somehow best served by leaving them in the care of a sole custodial parent? When the outcome of this little gem is that many, not all, but many of these parents then set out to coerce the child through a process of emotional and psychological manipulation to hate their other parent and other much-loved members of their families, resulting in a situation where usually within 2 years there is little or no more meaningful contact with that parent. Up to a quarter of the Western world's children are now growing up in an environment where hating the other parent is encouraged and rewarded. These vulnerable children know that in order to survive, they have to go along with this doctrine of hate. And the psychological effects on the children of forcibly having to exist in a toxic atmosphere of so much hate can be absolutely devastating. It's no accident that so many of our children are acting out of anger at having been abandoned in a hostile environment by society, which forces them to have to deal alone with complex problems they can't possibly comprehend or resolve. And many of these vulnerable, isolated children are growing up with perverse views and opinions which are based on a distorted perception of reality, forced upon them by a bitter, disturbed, dysfunctional adult. These children, by and large, started out with a deep love for both of their parents, yet are forced to hate and turn their back on half of their family. We simply cannot continue to sweep this injustice aside, turn a blind eye to their plight, and deny them the dignity, support and protection they're entitled to by virtue of existing international human rights conventions. Well, what is particularly disturbing is the fact that these are outdated laws and better alternatives are available, with other countries already well ahead of us. In Belgium, for instance, both responsible separated parents are now legally recognised as equal primary care parents, who each continue to share a near equal percentage of primary care parenting time with their children following separation. And if one parent refuses to hand the children over to the other parent at the agreed time, it's seen as abduction or kidnapping, which is a criminal offence, and it becomes a police matter. And habitual offenders face a 2-month jail term. That is justice and equality. If we consider ourselves to be responsible members of a civil society but continue to give up on these children, then we've given up on our own deeply held values, abandoned our own identity, and discarded our own humanity. And we need to seriously ask ourselves which principles of human decency we are still willing to uphold. Or are we as a community now so blind, ignorant and uncaring that we no longer are able to comprehend how it would feel if it happened to us? Do we not realise that if we continue to passively accept this evil amongst us without protesting against it, then we are, in effect, as guilty as the perpetrators? So in the interest of the vulnerable and helpless children of today, who are the parents and leaders of tomorrow, I strongly urge you to consider that we no longer deny our children their fundamental human right to love and be loved by both of their parents. Because if we continue to fail them, then history is going to judge our generation very harshly. In the meantime, until there is real justice and equality in the jurisdiction of family law in Australia, I will continue to regard not only men, but all responsible parents, both men and women, and especially the children, as losers. I thank you.